Campbell Island is situated 300 kilometres southeast of Auckland Island and 750 kilometres south of Dunedin. The island was discovered in late December 1809 by Captain Frederick Hasselberg in the brig Perseverance, but he did not land on it until the 4th of January 1810. On the same voyage he discovered Macquarie Island on the 11th of July 1810. Hasselberg claimed both islands for Great Britain. The Perseverance was the first ship constructed in the colony of New South Wales. A 136-ton brig, she was completed in 1807 in Sydney's first shipyard at Kirribilli, developed by Robert Campbell. Throughout these videos, when I refer to a ship, I'm using, where available, the description in Lloyd's Register of Shipping, which commenced in 1764. The ship's tonnage up until the mid-1800s referred to the cargo capacity, or tons burthen, using the builder's old measurement, or BOM. Displacement is the modern way of referring to a ship's weight, and gradually took over from BOM from about 1850. Robert Campbell was keen to enter the South Seas trade in whaling and especially sealing, as seal oil was clear, odourless and free from the rancid taste of whale or fish oil. It could be used in foodstuffs and in lamps, giving a very bright blue flame without any smell or smoke. It was also very economical for lamplight, about 100 millilitres being sufficient to run an ordinary wick for 12 hours. Seal oil could also be used to soften the fibres in the manufacture of cloth. Thus there was a heavy demand for the oil in Europe. Not much is known about Hasselberg, whose surname is spelt in various ways shown on the slide. Legal documents at the Australian National Library show his signature as Friedrich Hasselberg, and that's what I'll call him. Hasselberg was employed by the Sydney merchants Campbell and Co. He named the island after the company's co-founder, Robert Campbell. Robert Campbell was an immensely important figure in the early development of Sydney. So one might say that Campbell Island is rather more connected to Australia than it is to New Zealand. Hasselberg dropped off a gang of 7 sealers at Campbell Island after discovering it, returning in October to pick them up with their harvest of oil and skins. On the 4th of November 1810, while transporting the oil casks in a jolly boat from the shore to the Perseverance, the boat was struck broadside by a sudden gust of wind and overturned. Hasselberg, 12-year-old crewman George Allwright, and a female, Eliza Farr, who may have been the captain's mistress, were drowned. An American sealer out of New York, the brig Aurora of 180 tons under Captain Chase, had followed the Perseverance out of Sydney in September on rumours that she had found a new sealing ground. Aurora returned in December with the sad news of the fate of Captain Hasselberg. Unlike the Auckland Islands, only one ship is known to have been wrecked on Campbell Island. Curiously, it was the discovery vessel, Perseverance, wrecked in its namesake harbour in October 1828 while sealing. 2 of the crew were drowned. The year following the discovery, Another Robert Campbell vessel, the 130-ton brig Mary and Sally under Captain Feen, put into Campbell Island and landed a party to hunt seals for oil, but was forced to return to Sydney before retrieving them. Captain William Swain in the Enderby schooner Cumberland, on reaching Campbell Island in 1812, found that of the gang of 6 men left by the Mary and Sally, only one, Henry Neal, a cooper, remained alive. It appears that 2 months before his relief, all of his companions had gone on an excursion in a boat and had never returned. Neil, when rescued, was in a very debilitated state, brought on by despondency, but quickly recovered. This was the second boat tragedy on Campbell Island. The 350-ton corvette L'Uranie, under Captain Louis Claude de Salses de Freycinet, don't you just love these French names, bound for France, left Sydney on Christmas Day 1819, and passing the southern part of New Zealand, sighted Campbell Island on the 7th of January 1820. Freycinet wrote, "In general, the sterility aspect of this land is awful. A whitish-coloured rock appears bare there, and shows its arrangement in horizontal layers. It is in vain that our eyes have sought to discover traces of vegetation there. Everywhere the sea broke with force on sides which seemed to us to be very severe." Consequently, Freycinet did not attempt a landing, and sailed for Cape Horn. He was also in a hurry to get home after 2 years away exploring the South Pacific. On the 14th of February 1820, L'Uranie was wrecked in the Falkland Islands during the continuation of her journey home. All the crew survived, together with much of her scientific collection. Early in 1821, the brig Venus, under Captain Samuel Harvey, tried the old Campbell and Macquarie Island grounds for sealskins and elephant seal oil. About 20 tons of salt was landed at the head of Perseverance Harbour, and from what Captain Harvey saw there, he came to the conclusion that it would pay a boat's crew to remain. From Campbell Island the Venus sailed for Cloudy Bay. However, apart from a very lean trade in seal skins, Campbell Island proved to be a poor hunting ground for sealers and whalers, and so was largely ignored after 1823, despite the publication of the first Admiralty chart of the island, which considerably assisted in navigation. The 156-ton Enderby whaling schooner Eliza Scott, under Captain John Balleny, arrived at Campbell Island on the 10th of January 1839, in company with the 54-ton dandy-rigged cutter Sabrina, under Captain Thomas Freeman. Captain Freeman went ashore to try for skins and found 3 men and a woman who had been there for 4 years and who were in a wretched state. During that interval, they had obtained only 165 skins. The marooned persons were taken aboard the Eliza Scott on the understanding that their skins were to become the property of the Enderby Company. It was discovered they had been put ashore by the schooner New Zealand 4 years earlier, but this ship ran aground and burned on the south coast of the South Island, leaving nobody to report the castaways on Campbell Island. Two of the castaways, we don't know if the woman was one of them, then died when one of the rescue ships, the Sabrina, sank with all hands in a severe gale on the 24th of March 1839 on the way home from Antarctica. While at Campbell Island, Balleny and Freeman met with Captain John Biscoe, in command of the 136-ton Enderby bark, Lady Emma. He was on a sealing voyage. In 1830, Biscoe had been given command of the 150-ton brig Tuller and the cutter Lively by Enderby Brothers of London. Combining exploration with the search for new sealing grounds, Biscoe circumnavigated the Antarctic continent, discovering Enderby Land in 1831, Adelaide Island and the Biscoe Islands in 1832, as well as part of the west coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, naming it Graham's Land. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the Maori and the First Lieutenant Governor of the Territory of New Zealand, which was still part of the colony of New South Wales, on the 6th of February 1840. This cleared the way the following year for New Zealand to be separated from New South Wales and become a colony in its own right. The Sub-Antarctic islands, apart from Macquarie Island, were allocated to the new colony of New Zealand. By 1840, the scientists of three nations had succeeded in rousing their government's interest in Antarctic exploration. The expeditions that resulted were the well-known ones of Dumont d'Urville of France, Charles Wilkes of the United States, and James Clark Ross of Great Britain. Ross was supremely confident of his own considerable abilities and contemptuous of those of his rivals, especially Charles Wilkes. The chief stimulus for the British scientific backers of Ross was interest in the Earth's magnetic field and the desire to ascertain the position of the south magnetic pole. Gauss, the great mathematician, had calculated its probable position as 66 degrees south, 146 degrees east, in the neighbourhood of what later became named Adélie Land. When Ross arrived in Hobart from London via Cape Town on the 16th of August 1840 in his ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, waiting for him was a copy of the draft report and first uncorrected sketch maps of the very area he had intended to explore, kindly left for him by Charles Wilkes. Incensed at being preempted by the upstart Wilkes, Ross declared that Wilkes's maps were all wrong, the areas previously discovered, like Graham's Land, Enderby Land, Sabrina Land, and now Adélie Land, were merely scattered islands, and no Antarctic continent existed. Nevertheless, Ross abandoned his quest for the South Magnetic Pole off Adélie Land, notwithstanding that the cost of his voyage was being borne by financiers intent on that very quest, and decided to explore the area west of the western limit of Wilkes's chart. Accordingly, he laid course for the Auckland Islands, where he stayed for 3 weeks, before moving on to Campbell Island. The islander was spotted early on the 13th of December 1840. Ross had been advised to use Northeast Harbour, but not liking its exposure to the northeasterly winds, he bore away for Perseverance Harbour, whose heads were entered at 10:30 a.m. Sail had to be reduced on account of the strong gusts of wind which came down from the high lands with astounding force, the more dangerous from succeeding the light and baffling winds that accompany the intervals between squalls, he wrote. It took the ships, the Erebus and the Terror, 4 hours of hard work to beat up the outer arm of the harbour. Rounding the point into the inner harbour, Erebus ran aground, but hawsers were run out to the shore and the ship was worked off. Immediately afterwards, the Terror grounded at the same point, at the top of high water. Stores had to be landed and some of her water discharged to enable her to be floated off on the next high tide. The 4 days at Campbell Island were spent in replenishing the water, seine fishing without success, exploring and surveying the harbour. Given the problems encountered by Erebus and Terror, Ross ensured that the soundings of the harbour bottom was very comprehensive. Magnetic observations were also taken, while zoological and botanical specimens were collected with tremendous zeal by Joseph Hooker and David Lyle. Signs of the occasional occupation by sealers were noted by Ross. There were some huts on both sides of the cove north of the Erebus anchorage, probably Tucker Cove, and by the side of a stream in the northwest corner of the harbour at Camp Cove. Ross recorded that there were graves of several seamen who had evidently been employed in the seal fishing, and among them that of a woman who had been accidentally drowned by the upsetting of a boat in the harbour. The woman's grave may have been that of Eliza Farr, drowned when Hasselberg's boat was upset in November 1810. In only 2 days of collecting at Campbell Island, the young botanist Joseph Hooker, afterwards to achieve eminence in his field and a knighthood, identified between 200 and 300 species with the able assistance of David Lyle. Of the 200 to 300 species collected, at least 66 were rare or previously unknown flowering plants. The species found in Campbell Island, but which had not been found in the Auckland Islands, were almost all typical of a sub-Antarctic climate, some being confined to the island, and others previously considered peculiar to the southern extremity of South America, Tierra del Fuego. Ross departed on the 17th of December and set course directly south for Antarctica. During the next 20 or more years, there were no great expeditions to the southern seas. New Zealanders were much too busy settling down in their new home to worry about isolated, inhospitable islands. In 1868, following a spate of shipwrecks on the Auckland Islands, the New Zealand government established a series of castaway huts and supply depots on the Auckland and Campbell Islands. A policy of regular visits to the sub-Antarctic islands by government steamers was instituted to check on the supply depots and pick up any castaways. The first description of the geology and of the flora and fauna of the island, furnished from the observations of a New Zealand visitor, was given by Henry Armstrong, who accompanied the whaling brig Amherst on the first cruise by a government ship to the Auckland and Campbell Islands in 1868. Armstrong's account was read before the Wellington Philosophical Society by James Hector, the director of the Geological Survey of New Zealand. 25 rock specimens had been brought back from Campbell Island by Armstrong. After describing the specimens, Hector concluded by saying, "There must be a considerable variety in the geology of the island, which is a true rocky island and not a mere volcanic mass built up by submarine eruptions." James Cook's first voyage had been made to the South Pacific in 1769 to observe the transit of Venus, the passage of the planet across the face of the Sun, as depicted in this little animation showing the orbits of Earth and Venus around the Sun. The 1769 observations had not led to a satisfactory result. The next transit was due in 1874, and astronomers around the world were determined to try again. A network of observation stations were to be set up worldwide. By observing the transit from different locations on Earth a known distance apart, if the time at which Venus crossed the face of the Sun could be accurately measured from several points on the Earth's surface, the distance of our planet from the Sun could be calculated. At least that was the theory. The French Academy of Science in particular made very thorough preparations over the 2 years prior to the transit to ensure success. 3 observation points were planned in each hemisphere. Many places were considered in the southern hemisphere, and the final choice fell on Noumea, St. Paul in the Indian Ocean, and Campbell Island. The choice of Campbell Island was influenced by François-Édouard Renal, who had spent 11 years mining in the Australian goldfields. A draper, Charles Sarpi, told Renal of a rumoured rich silver and tin lode on Campbell Island. Renal chartered a 56-ton schooner, the Grafton, in Sydney, and hired American Captain Thomas Musgrave to sail it. The crew included 20-year-old English seaman George Harris, 28-year-old Shetland Island seaman Alexander McLaren, and as cook, 23-year-old Portuguese Henri Forgues. Embarking on the 12th of November 1863, they arrived at Campbell Island on the 2nd of December. While exploring the island from their anchorage in Abraham's Bosom, now known as South East Harbour, Renal suffered severe food poisoning and almost died. Once he recovered, and finding the search for the fabled silver lode fruitless, the Grafton set sail for Auckland Island. On January 1st, 1864, the Grafton reached Auckland Island and put into Port Carnley. The next morning, a storm blew the Grafton onto the rocks and she was wrecked. Fortunately, the crew managed to get ashore and later retrieved most of their provisions and instruments. The epic tale of the shipwreck, their survival, and ultimate voyage to Invercargill in a boat they constructed from pieces of the wreck is told in Renal's book Wrecked on a Reef. Despite his ordeal, when Renal was interviewed by the French Academy of Sciences, he had no hesitation in endorsing their choice of Campbell Island, as their first choice, Auckland Island, had already been assigned to the Germans, and Macquarie Island had no suitable landing places protected from the rough seas. with a thorough attention to detail and preparation typical of France's scientific leadership in Europe at the time, the New Caledonia-based naval frigate Vere of 1,625 tons, commanded by Captain Jacquemart, spent almost a month at the island from the 28th of November to the 25th of December 1873. His officers and men made a thorough survey of the coastline and the harbours, erected a platform for the transit equipment on the headland between Camp Cove and Garden Cove, and constructed a path from there to the beach. They also made a garden and planted potatoes and other edible vegetables. They reported that penguins, seals, albatross and rats abounded, but there was no trace of pigs. The depot, placed there 5 years before by the Amherst, was found to be still intact. The Ministry of Marine made available Jean-Jacques Anatole Bouquet de la Grille of the Hydrographic Office as scientific leader of the Campbell Island Party, with Philippe Eugène Hutt as assistant. Hutt subsequently achieved fame in the field of geodesy, while Lieutenant Courrecolles, the expedition photographer, later rose to the rank of admiral. Antoine Pierre-Henri Fihot of the Museum of Natural History also joined the expedition. He doubled as medical doctor, biologist, botanist, and geologist. The scientific party comprised 4 scientists plus technicians and carpenters, almost all of whom were part of the French Navy, assisted by the 8 officers and the crew of the Vere. The scientific equipment included a daguerreotype camera with a telescope and a silver mirror, the first use of photography for recording a transit. The Vere left Sydney on the 2nd of September 1874. Blessed by favourable winds and weather, she arrived at Campbell Island a week later and anchored in Perseverance Harbour. Finding the campsite selected by the Vere the previous year quite unsuitable, the party scouted further and settled on a small bay to the south, which they named Venus Cove. A stone jetty was built to facilitate landing the equipment and supplies. Pens were built for the sheep and pigs brought as food. It took 2 weeks to assemble the prefabricated buildings on the cemented rubble foundations, slowed by the failure of the cement to set in the cold. Paul Dury, an instrument technician, died of typhoid fever on the 23rd of September and was buried on the shore of the bay opposite Venus Cove. By the 1st of October the buildings were habitable, and the party moved from the ship to take up residence, blessed with a 2-hour light show by the Aurora Australis. There were 2 separate huts for photoheliographs to record the transit, a tidal gauge, an astronomical observatory to determine the latitude and longitude of the station, a hut for the gradiometer, measuring the gravity field, and a hut housing the equipment to conduct magnetometer measurements to determine the magnetic variation. On the 19th of October, Vere left for New Zealand, carrying mail, reports and so on, while the scientists began their observations. The surveyors continued mapping, and Dr. Fihot commenced his botanical and zoological studies of the island. Veal returned with mail and supplies on the 19th of November, reducing the need to supplement their diet with albatross and mutton birds. The chronometers had also been checked and corrected with those at the Astronomical Observatory in Christchurch to ensure accurate longitude determination of the Campbell Island Observatory, so vital to the mathematical calculation of the distance to the Sun. The day of the transit, 9th of December, began with bad weather, mist and rain, but at 10 a.m. it began to clear. At 1:02 p.m. the dark spot of Venus was observed in the corona just prior to beginning its passage across the Sun. Then a cloud moved across for 15 minutes, after which the Sun reappeared for about 20 seconds with Venus halfway across, long enough to take a reading from the inner edge of the Sun before the clouds once more obscured the Sun. That was it, after 2 years of work. Some consolation was taken later by the French in that other observers in the New Zealand area, including those in Christchurch, and the Americans on the Chatham Islands, were equally unsuccessful. Not only that, but the worldwide effort did not succeed in producing a measure of the distance to the Sun with an accuracy any better than in 1769. It took almost 3 weeks to dismantle everything, including the buildings, pack and transport them to the Veer, before departing for Dunedin on the morning of the 28th of December. Nevertheless, considerable scientific data was acquired, including an accurate determination of latitude and longitude, magnetic inclination, declination and intensity, as well as variation over 3 months, tidal variation, gravity and seismometer measurements. The charts produced by the French naval officers subsequently formed the basis of maps of the island and British Admiralty charts for several decades. Many geographic features were named by the expedition after its own personnel and members of the Transit Committee in Paris. Henri Fiot collected and described an immense range of quite beautiful botanical species. These are just a small taste of the wonderful range of plant life on Campbell Island. We now come to the saga of the 27-metre-long, 2-masted, single-deck schooner Sarah W. Hunt. Gross weight 256 tonnes, registered for 116 tonnes cargo, built in Maine for the West Indies sugar trade and launched on the 9th of January 1876. In 1880 she was purchased by Captain Sanford Stoddard Minor, with his brother Ebenezer as silent partner. The schooner was in poor shape, being so leaky the pumps had to be manned even in port, with rigging to match. Nevertheless, the brothers sailed her to New Bedford to be fitted out for poaching seals on the Sub-Antarctic islands. The story of her 1883 to 1885 voyage and the stranding of her crew on Campbell Island is told wonderfully by Joan Druitt in her book The Elephant Voyage. It would make a gripping film at least as exciting as Moby Dick. Sanford Miner, the ruthless, unscrupulous skipper, makes even the notoriously tough, often brutal whaling captains of New Bedford look like pussies. The schooner left New Bedford with a crew of 12, only 2 of whom had ever been to sea before, on the 11th of July 1883, sailing via the Cape of Good Hope and skirting southern Australia direct for Macquarie Island, her first stop since leaving New Bedford. Finding no seals there, Captain Miner headed for Campbell Island, anchoring in Perseverance Harbour on the 22nd of November. After plundering the provisions in the castaway huts, he set the crew to repairing the damage from the long journey. 5 days later, the port and starboard whaleboats left the vessel at 6 a.m. with orders to search inshore along the southeast coast for seals, leaving only the steward, George Duncan, and Captain Miner on board. When the boats failed to return after 3 days' absence with no provisions, Captain Miner and the steward, who was not a seaman, managed to get the schooner underway and headed out of the harbour, then steered northwest for New Zealand. Meanwhile, on the same day, the starboard boat made it back to the island and the 6 exhausted survivors staggered ashore. By sheer chance, on the 14th of December, the tiny New Zealand government 31-ton schooner Kekino, under the Scots captain James Gregg, entered Perseverance Harbour with 5 seamen sworn in as special constables on board to enforce the Seals Fisheries Protection Act. They found a whaleboat on the beach at the western end of the harbour. At the castaway hut, they found 6 survivors from the Sarah W. Hunt in a pitiable condition. Kekino was far too small to take the survivors on board and transport them back to New Zealand, so Gregg and his crew provided succour to the survivors in the hope that the Sarah W. Hunt would soon return to look for them. Instead, on the 21st of December, the government schooner-rigged steamer Stella of 136 tons was observed steaming up the channel. The survivors were taken on board, and next day the Stella sailed for the Auckland Islands in case the other whaleboat had been blown there. Arriving on the 23rd of December, the Stella made a thorough search, but found no trace of any castaways. The Stella arrived in Dunedin on the 26th of December 1883 with the 6 survivors on board. For the next few months, both the newspapers and the courts were busy with various allegations and hearings about Captain Miner's behaviour. The American consul in New Zealand officially discharged the survivors from the crew of the Sarah W. Hunt, which saved them from any chance of being considered deserters, and placed the cost of repatriation to the US on the consul. The survivors of the Campbell Island ordeal arrived in San Francisco on the Zealandia on the 23rd of March 1884. Their fate after that is unknown. Captain Miner recruited a new crew who mutinied and deserted on arrival in Punta Arenas, Chile. It took 9 months to recruit another crew to sail on to New London, arriving on the 14th of September 1885, the ship as empty as the day she left. The periodic visits to the Sub-Antarctic Islands by government ships sometimes provided an opportunity for scientists to hitch a ride. The botanist Thomas Kirk, for example, and amateur collector Frederick Chapman joined the government steamship Hinamoa on her annual voyage in an itinerary which included Campbell Island, where they arrived on the 14th of January 1890. Chapman commented that in the part of the island where we now were, the plants, though not as numerous as at Adams Island, were even more beautiful. He was particularly taken with the pleurophyllum and the golden lily anthericum. Kirk collected specimens for the museums and gardens in Wellington and Dunedin. He donated a number of dried plants to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London. In November 1894, the New Zealand government offered for auction 4 21-year leases on the Auckland and Campbell Islands. Run 501 was the northern part of Auckland Island, 502 was the southern part, 510 was Adams Island, and 511 was the whole of Campbell Island. The successful bidder for Campbell Island was a Mr. Gordon of Gisborne, who offered a £15 per annum annual rent. 400 sheep were taken down along with timber for building in 1895. It was difficult to find shepherds who could cope with the isolation, and a few years later men from the Shetland Islands, off the north of Scotland, were engaged to run the farm. By 1900, when he could no longer sustain the venture financially, Gordon was bought out by Captain Tucker of the Gisborne Militia, and stocking started in earnest with at least 3 shipments of about 1,000 sheep. Records are sketchy, but it appears that one shipment was Leicester Merino Cross, another Lincoln Merino Cross, possibly some Merinos, and one shipment was reported in the Otago Daily Times simply as 1,100 sheep. Over the next few years, the sheep population increased to peak at about 8,000 around 1913, and then, as the palatable plants became eaten out, went into a steady decline, as did the finances. From the 1920s, there were fewer ships to service the island, and it became difficult to get enough supplies. 5,000 sheep were liberated on the island in 1927, but falling meat and sheep prices meant that in 1931 John Warren, the last leaseholder, left the island destitute. About 4,000 feral sheep were left behind. During the Second World War, a coast watcher noted that there were about 20 head of cattle on Campbell Island in 1941, but very little attention was paid to these animals either then or subsequently. Little is known about the cattle, but from photographs taken of them in 1976, it would appear that they probably originated from a largely shorthorn type breed. In 1954, the island was declared a reserve for the protection of flora and fauna, and there was increasing pressure to get rid of both the sheep and the cattle, particularly because of the effect that they were having on the native vegetation. Some of the sheep were taken to the mainland in 1976. The remaining sheep were shot out by 1992, and some accounts give the date of 1984 for the extermination of the cattle. Another attempt to utilise the resources of Campbell Island was made in the early part of 1909 by a party of 11 South Island whalers led by Jack and Harry Norton. They travelled in the government ship Hinamoa, taking with them a launch equipped with an oil engine and also a 10-metre whaleboat. They intended to cooperate with the lessee of the sheep station on the island, and upon arrival they proposed to shear the 7,500 sheep, after which they expected to have time to erect the whaling station in time for the start of the season. The men found the ruins of an old whaling station at North East Harbour, complete with jetty. They didn't favour this site, however, and built their new station at North West Bay, now known as Borchgrevink Bay. Although there was no shelter for ships in this bay, they managed to find a safe place for their whaleboat and launch. They captured 13 whales that year, and would have got more had they not lost some of their gear. They also reported that they were considering erecting try-works to enable them to obtain oil as well as whalebone. In 1910, a second whaling station was proposed in North East Harbour by the Cook brothers, who had had several years of whaling off North Auckland. Cook's party had no interest in the sheep station, but intended to develop the whaling industry seriously, with a view to obtaining both oil and whalebone. They also intended to can the whale meat for the Oriental market and to convert the refuse into fertiliser. They had obtained a special vessel from England for use as a whale chaser, and a communications vessel was being built for them in Auckland to ply between Campbell Island and Bluff. In 1910, Norton's gang captured 9 right whales of very large size, and although they were still not obtaining any of the oil, their profits from the whalebone, together with their interest in the sheep station, had brought them a satisfactory financial return. 9 men from Norton's gang arrived in New Zealand in February 1912 via the Hinamoa for a holiday. They reported that in 1911 they had secured 8 whales. It was not until 1911 that Cook's party got established with a personnel totalling 15 men. Their chaser Hananui was a 44-ton vessel capable of 10 knots and was commanded by a Captain Carmichael. This ship was equipped with a harpoon gun. During their first season they killed 13 whales, which produced 200 tons of oil, as well as whalebone. From all accounts, the 2 whaling gangs got on well together, and Cook's vessel was at times used to transport the island wool to New Zealand. Norton, however, was worried about the matter of more regular communications with New Zealand, as he had great difficulty in getting stores and mail. He also complained that his men could not undertake sealing, as the sealing season was always closed before the licences arrived. A similar plan was started by Murray and Matthewson, who arranged for the steamer Himatangi of 479 gross tons to tow the 10-ton motor-launch Komuri to Campbell Island for service in the whaling season. The Komuri was unfortunately lost very soon after her arrival in 1917. Her engine broke down when she was well out in a heavy sea, and she had to be abandoned. The crew had a desperate pull to the shore in a surf boat, which they had in tow at the time. The adverse weather conditions and the isolation made it hard for whalers to make a going concern of the various stations set up on the island. The stocks of the right whale were so low that the men could not be persuaded to stay down there for the small rewards that resulted. One by one, the stations collapsed after only 1 or 2 seasons' operations. In this way, at least the whale survived. Shortly before the beginning of the failed attempts to start a whaling industry on Campbell Island, a party of 22 scientists from the Philosophical Institute of Canterbury in New Zealand travelled on the government steamer Hinamoa that left Bluff on the 14th of November 1907 to make her annual inspection tour of the Sub-Antarctic islands. When they reached the Auckland Islands, the expedition found the survivors of the Dundonald shipwreck. One of the survivors, Charles Eyre, was appointed cook for the Campbell Island party, who stayed 8 days on Campbell Island from the 17th of November 1907. The main object was to extend the magnetic survey of New Zealand, but the first geological map of Campbell Island was one outcome from the expedition. The Second World War introduced the next era of human occupation, coast watching. It was sparked by the Erlangen incident. On the 26th of August 1939, with war only a week away, the German merchant ship Erlangen did a runner from Dunedin's Otago harbour, even though her bunkers were nearly empty of coal. She headed for Carnley Harbour in the Auckland Islands to load wood to fuel her boilers. Her crew laboured to cut 235 tonnes of rata trees over several weeks. That almost got them to Santiago, Chile, where they arrived on the 11th of November 1939 under sail. The incident was very loosely, depicted in the 1955 film The Sea Chase, starring John Wayne. Some of the Hollywood embellishments included beautifully manicured, supposedly rata logs for fuel from Auckland Island, and Lana Turner as a glamorous spy to spice up the captain's love life. When the New Zealand government was informed, it decided to mount a coast watch at Auckland and Campbell Islands. Codenamed the Cape Expedition, the Coast Watchers established a station at Tucker Cove in Perseverance Harbour. 3 vessels took it in turn to service the stations: the 36-metre auxiliary schooner Tagua, the 22-metre auxiliary ketch Ranui of 57 tonnes, built at the Norwegian whaling station on Stewart Island in 1936, and the twin-screw auxiliary ketch New Golden Hind, the biggest private yacht yet built in New Zealand at that time. One of the hardy men of the Cape Expedition during 1944 and into 1945 was recent geology graduate Robin Oliver. He was later recruited by Sir Douglas Mawson and joined the staff of Adelaide University in 1958, where he lectured me in metamorphic petrology in the early 1960s and supervised my master's thesis. Robin was a much revered Antarctic explorer with 7 expeditions under his belt and a whole volume on Antarctica dedicated to him. Dr. Oliver made good use of his sojourn on Campbell Island and subsequently produced the definitive report on the geology of Campbell Island as one of several published scientific byproducts of the coast-watching activity. Campbell Island is one of the 5 sub-Antarctic island groups that comprise the exposed parts of the 800,000 square kilometre Campbell Plateau portion of the submerged continent of Zealandia, discussed in my companion video on Auckland Island. Paleozoic schists form the basement of Campbell Island. The schists are overlain unconformably by Upper Cretaceous quartz conglomerates and carbonaceous mudstones. Limestones of Lower Eocene to Middle Oligocene age overlie the Cretaceous rocks conformably. The Lower Pliocene shoal point tuffs and breccias are the next youngest sediments, deposited partly on land and partly in the sea. They are the first manifestations of igneous activity which culminated in the outpouring of basaltic and andesitic lavas of the Campbell Island volcanics to form a volcanic cone centred on the western side of the present island. The vent has been removed by erosion, including by glaciers in the Holocene, which has excavated portions of the volcanic pile and exposed basalt lava flows and swarms of dikes and sills. Along the coast, cliffs of columnar basalt formed by thermal stresses produced during cooling form outcrops of spectacular hexagonal cylindrical colonnades. The remnants of the volcano form a deeply dissected pile approximately 14 kilometres in diameter, covering an area of around 100 square kilometres above sea level. The Tucker Cove base on Campbell Island was kept open as a weather station after the war ended. In 1956, a new meteorological station was built at Beeman Point in time for the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58, a milestone in international scientific research and cooperation. The Campbell Island Station was part of the network of atmospheric observations. Tides, earthquakes and geomagnetic changes were also measured, contributing to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts and their profound implications on manned spaceflight. From then on through to its conversion to an automatic operation in 1995, the Campbell Island Station typically had a staff of 12, appointed for 12 months at a time. Although the buildings remain, the station is no longer permanently staffed, but part of the complex is utilised periodically by scientists and Department of Conservation management staff. Fortunately, during our visit, there were 8 scientists in residence to welcome us, some engaged on an Albatross banding program, while others were conducting a study of the local sea lion population. We had departed Auckland Island at 10 p.m. on Sunday the 3rd of February and made good time overnight to arrive off the northeast tip of Campbell Island next morning, being greeted by the usual blustery conditions but with sunny breaks. On North Cape, just opposite Bull Rock, there is a large colony of black black-browed albatross, otherwise known as the Campbell mollymawk. It's one of the smaller albatrosses, characterised by having a yellowish-orange bill and an all-white body. The eyes are honey-coloured, which is the main distinguishing feature from the other black-browed mollymawks, which have dark eyes. We were escorted down the east coast by swooping albatross, skimming the waves and soaring overhead. They were to become the stars of our visit later. As we entered Perseverance Harbour, we could see a bunch of sea lions at Davis Point on the north side of the entrance. This is one of the largest of the local concentrations of sea lions on Campbell Island. Apart from the Auckland Islands, Campbell is the only significant breeding area for New Zealand sea lions in the Sub-Antarctic. The characteristically dark-coloured males were out swimming, while the light-tanned females frolicked on the shore. Continuing up the harbour, the Marinus Fatava anchored in the approved zone off the research station at Beeman Point. The Zodiac shuttle service took us to the jetty at Beeman Point.
That's okay. Let's tie that up to the...
We were greeted by some sub-adult New Zealand sea lions loitering around the jetty, who provided some light entertainment as we waited for everyone to arrive. Formerly known as the hooker sea lion, they can be quite frisky and a little aggressive.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome to Campbell Island. Sorry you can only stay for a few hours, but I'm sure we've turned the weather on for you, and hopefully if you go out the boardwalk you'll see a few Royal Albatross at the top of the boardwalk. We've got 8 people here working on the Royal Albatross. We're here for 2 months, and we're doing surveys of the nests, looking for banded birds. Been a banding program on the island for basically since the late 1950s. And a lot of Royal Albatross were banded in those years. So we're doing a survey looking for them, partly because they weren't always put on very well, and the large bands, stainless steel bands, are quite springy, so they open up, and some birds have been injured by the bands. So we're basically doing a tidy up, doing a sweep of the island over several years, try and find bands and remove them from the birds. And in a study area that's up at the top of the boardwalk, we've got about 200 nests where we're rebanding birds with a stronger band.
We were then free to wander up the hill to the principal albatross nesting ground between Cole Peak and Mount Lyell. This is the old rail track built to take heavy loads up to the accommodation huts. On the way, a resident elephant seal was lounging about, taking in the sunshine. The boardwalk takes you past some of the spectacular botanical wonders of the island. The inhabitants of the Albatross rookery seemed quite unfussed by having a bunch of tourists getting up close and personal. Campbell Island is a major world centre for albatross, and most of the southern royals, which are the largest albatross on the planet, breed there. Every second year, a royal albatross will come to breed on the windswept ridges of Campbell Island. Apparently, the birds are exacting in their requirements for their nesting habitat, with specific needs for the actual nest site, nest material, display ground, loafing spots, and various other factors. More than 35,000 southern royal albatross were banded on Campbell Island between 1941 and 1998, mostly by staff of the meteorological station, even though they were generally not trained in bird handling and banding techniques. Unfortunately, the use of untrained volunteer banders meant that many bands were applied incorrectly. The small number of overseas band returns, approximately 1 to 2 birds per year during the 1990s to the early 2000s, was of limited value, compared with distribution data that can be gained from satellite tracking, for example. Thus, a new program was designed to find as many banded albatrosses on Campbell Island as possible and remove their bands. Birds in the Coll and the Mowbray study areas would also have their bands removed, but these would be replaced by new, more reliable bands or with transponders. The results of this 5-year program by a small, dedicated group of ornithologists led by Peter Moore are covered in this report, which is available online. Albatross mate for life, which means 40 to 50 years, so the choosing of a partner is prolonged and elaborate. One of the most interesting displays are what are called gamming rituals, where young birds gather in groups to check each other out. There's lots of screaming, calling to the sky, clapping of wings, spreading of wings, pecking, nibbling, little altercations, and a constant dropping in and leaving of other birds. All fascinating to watch. I was hoping these two were heading up the hill to take off into the wind, but I guess they thought better of it. Just lying back in the tussock and watching these magnificent birds soar in great swooping flypasts is remarkably therapeutic. Regrettably, our few hours on the island were nearly up, and it was time to return to the jetty for the ride back to Marina Svetava. There is just so much to see on this little lonely gem of the Sub-Antarctic. You really need several days to get even a taste. Departing in the late afternoon, we set course south to the Ross Sea. First landfall will be Cape Adare.